Hello and welcome to Agency Office Hours for March 2022. I'm Karl Sakas, agency consultant and coach, and we'll be answering questions about helping you grow your agency more profitably this year and beyond. Here's a preview of the questions we'll be covering today. First, I've received a lot of questions in the past week about how to communicate with your team about the crisis in Ukraine. That raises a broader question. What do you do when bad things are happening in the world or even in your town? What do you say to your team? How do you handle that? I have some tips. Then Alex in Oklahoma has a question about team morale. How do you manage your team without things turning into micromanagement? Then we will discuss outsourcing tips with today's episode sponsor, Manish from E2M Solutions. Have some tips about improving how you outsource to white label partners at your agency. Then Jenny in Virginia has a question about software tools. She and her colleague Kelly will be joining us. We'll talk through what are some of the best software options for agencies like yours. Have some suggestions there, plus some resources in chat if you're joining us live. And finally, Ross in Michigan has a question about approaching client meetings. Specifically, how many people from your agency should be in each client meeting? It's one of those, it depends, but I'll help you find the right answer for you and your agency. If I didn't mention your question, feel free to submit your question for a future agency office hours. We're meeting here live every second Tuesday in this time slot. And if you don't have questions, you're welcome to join and just listen. We are an introvert-friendly event. You don't have to turn your camera on if you're not asking a question. As a reminder, we are recording today, so don't share anything out loud that you don't want to become public. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in chat. What's your agency? Where are you joining us from? So first up, crisis communication. Not a fun topic, but definitely one that is very important. As you know, there's a significant crisis and both humanitarian and beyond in Ukraine right now. And the question is, although your agency can't directly do anything about it, right? You're not, you're not involved in world diplomacy. It raises an important question. Your team is wondering, what do you think about what's going on and also how it impacts them? You're not going to know exactly what to say, and that's okay, but you need to say something. You need to do something. Now, what's the right choice? Well, here's potential language to consider. For instance, you could say to your team something like this: I know it's hard to focus right now, given what's going on in the world. If you need additional time to refocus, let your manager or your project manager know so we can adjust the schedule accordingly. You're not saying they have to set aside who they are as a human amidst what's going on. Ultimately, the goal is to give people space. And if people need some additional space as they refocus, you're also getting some additional communication from them so that your projects generally stay on track, retainers generally stay on track. Things won't be 100%, but at least you won't be surprised, rather than expecting magical thinking that everything will continue business as usual. You want to be realistic. You also want to be caring. Depending on your overall approach to leading and managing people, you may choose to be more vulnerable, right? Acknowledging how scary things are, regardless of your location. And, speaking of location, this is true when bad things happen and are in the news, regardless of whether we're looking at a global perspective, national, or even local to where you and your team members live. All the more reason to keep an eye on what's going on, especially if you have a remote team. You might not be directly impacted, but others certainly may be. You also might want to consider, do you want to make a donation? Do you want to make a broader public statement? Do you want to do something else to help share where you're coming from, where your agency is coming from, and things along those lines? running an agency, if you're the owner of an agency or in a leadership role, it's very challenging at times because there's no one right answer about what to do. But it also means you have a lot of flexibility about what you say, right? There's not a, corporate overlord controlling what is going on. I'm curious if you want to share in chat, how have you communicated with your team about what's happening in Ukraine? Please feel free to share in chat. We'll share any keynotes later in today's agency office hours. Kate, is there anything that you would add as we think about communication? I know early last week, I was communicating with a lot of clients, agency owners, and also newsletter subscribers about what to say. And the language I shared there about acknowledging that, it's hard to focus. If people need more time, let their manager know so they can get more time. Kate, is there anything you'd add on that?
Yeah, I think actually Sean just put in chat, do lots of listening and lots of empathy, just realizing that we're all human and we're all trying to figure this out together and understand that your team may be struggling with things in their lives, whether it's a global item or it's something personal. So just having empathy and realizing that your team is human and being there for them.
Kate, thank you. And Sean, thank you for your perspective on that. And if you're joining us live, we've shared some resources, including also how to deal with when you are having a personal problem that may not be part of the broader, world news landscape, but when you're having a personal problem, along with some tips on, approaches to self-care. People talk a lot about self-care. My therapist recently had a good definition of it. The idea of self-care is that you're able to structure your day-to-day life so that you don't feel like you need to escape from it. As business owners and leaders, we're in a unique, privileged spot that we can structure what our day-to-day is like within reason. So if you have anything else you'd add on that, please share it in chat. Now, our next question is from Alex in Oklahoma. Alex, if you want to come on video, we'll go ahead and add you on screen here. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karl, for having me. I really appreciate all your talks at Inbound, so I'm a huge fan. So
thank you. Well, I'm glad you're here. So from a question perspective, to paraphrase your question, then if you could elaborate a little bit on what you shared, you had said, how do you increase motivation for fully remote employees without turning into an annoying manager or perhaps a micromanager? Could you elaborate a bit on your question?
Of course. So some background on me. I recently joined my agency after working at a more junior level at a previous agency. This is my first time in a more managerial position. At present, I had been managing a team about 5 to 6 freelance writers. I'm a content manager. But now as the team expands, as we receive more clients, we're looking to increase our internal bandwidth for having internal writing capacity. So I am currently tasked with managing just one actual FTE full-time employee for the first time. This individual is remote currently, is planning to relocate to our city. However, in this kind of remote capacity, I've been really struggling with how to not treat this person like a freelancer because those needs and wants are very different. Right. Even though the exact same activities are transpiring, we're caught through this electronic barrier and we don't have a lot of face-to-face. But also, how do I encourage accountability without feeling like I need to look at time tracked on specific tasks? Because I mean, I wouldn't want someone doing that to me. But there is that need of, I need to see that we are continuing with production, even though I can't see you in my office space yet. So that's kind of where we're at on that situation.
Got it. Well, there are a few ways we could approach this. One, I just want to acknowledge, even if someone had tons of managerial experience, managing people remotely is still a challenge. So you're not alone in facing that. And the fact that you've recognized it and you're reaching out for help, that's a good sign, right? Rather than just, putting your head down and just trying to power through things. So kudos on asking. That's good. That challenge about, say, freelancers versus full-time employees, indeed, if someone is a freelancer, they are a contractor, they are technically running their own business. Whereas if someone is an employee, well, they are an employee, especially if they're full-time. You generally have their dedicated time, hopefully dedicated attention within reason, life comes up, throughout the day that they're working. In general, a freelancer should be able to choose how they approach the work, right? You can say, here's the assignment, here's what success looks like, please get it done. And they figure out how to do it. With an employee, you do have more control over things, though in an ideal world, you'd have employees who think like owners, who are thinking about how do they make the business better, how do they improve things like that. But there is a difference, which you've noticed. An employee generally is going to be more responsive, right? Because they are focused, especially full-time, on your agency versus trying to figure out, when are they available? If we need them on a client meeting, when can they join? When can the client join? This and that. I still do recommend, even with a full-time employee, you do some conversation about how meetings would work, right? So that you don't just suddenly add a meeting to someone's schedule, 15 minutes before the meeting starts. That'll include some communication with them about what info do they need before the meeting happens, especially thinking around content creation. Have they had a chance to review the brief for the work? Do they have context on the client? For instance, my first day at an agency, joined a new agency in 2011. I was put on a client meeting with one of our largest clients with no prep, no background. I just knew they were one of our biggest clients and I was going to be handling them, but I knew nothing else about them. Day one, I was on the client meeting. Now, fortunately, one of my colleagues ended up running the meeting, so I could just sort of smile and nod for the most part and sort of see what I could observe about the client. But I think in that case, the only kind of briefing that I got was like 5 minutes before the call from our salesperson. So don't do that.
Yeah, no. That sounds like a worst nightmare scenario, honestly.
Yeah. So although I had taken improv comedy training, so the improv training was helpful in figuring out what to do. But let's talk a bit about the sort of that sense of electronic wall next. But what's your reaction to what we've covered so far?
Yeah, I think one thing that I have been struggling with is communicating what success looks like. I think that's a huge takeaway. I know you were applying it more to the freelancers, but I don't know if I've been doing a really good job at communicating to my employee what success looks like. And so I mean, it's one of those things that it goes for all life domains. It's like you can't be upset that someone's not meeting your expectations if those expectations are not clearly communicated. So
absolutely. So and that is where over communication comes in. Like you probably should not be talking with your employee like every hour of every day. That's a bit much, but that includes being clear about what success looks like. I have a framework, and Kate has shared a link to that in chat, that I call values, goals, and resources, or VGR. The idea is that whenever you want someone's help on something, they need to know the values, goals, and resources to consider. Now, some of those are at an agency level. What are the agency's values, goals, and resources? But it can also apply at a client level. So say you assign something to one of your team members, whether the employee or some of the freelancers. Part of the values could include something about, how perfect does the first draft need to be? Does it need to be, for instance, typo free? Or is for the very first one, it's more about getting the ideas down and, and then you'll fix typos in the revision. When it comes to goals, that could include things like, What is the deadline? Is there a word count target or range? You could say to someone, a blog post should be 1,000 words, but say if it's 950, is that okay? If it's 1,050, is that okay? Like, there's value in giving, here's the baseline goal, and then you might have an adjusted goal. You could say, target is 1,000, it needs to be at least 1,000. It could go up to 1,200. It really shouldn't be longer than that, right? Now they understand what they can work with. And that also ties into resources. In a sense, that kind of word count range is a resource constraint as well. But that also includes saying, for instance, here's where that particular client's style guide is. Here's what you should know there. Here are their brand guidelines, if that's specific. Here's a link to the last 2 of these that we did that say they weren't involved in them. They could see some examples of what's going on. Whenever I hear challenges among clients, among agency owners and leaders, where their team member isn't getting something done, often it's because they didn't know the values, goals, and resources to follow. So it's not too surprising that people didn't do what was expected because expectations were fuzzy. Thoughts on how you might shift how you communicate with any of your team members?
This is all very fantastic. I think it's funny because I feel we're really good at communicating the detailed approach, but we're not great, or at least in my department, we're not excelling at communicating the values behind what it is what we're doing. And for me personally, I find my motivation increases when I understand the values and the why behind what we're doing. And so I think obviously it makes sense that the through line that other people would find that valuable as well.
Absolutely. And by the way, for everyone else who's joining live today, feel free to share in chat. What are your tips for managing remote employees? So Alex, thinking through, the different moving parts involved, we talked about over communication. One good way to avoid micromanagement is to pre-schedule check-ins with team members, because it's not micromanagement if it's a pre-scheduled check-in. So, that could take different forms. One way to think about it is do an initial kickoff or initial conversation with the team member. And then maybe you might have a check-in at either 10 or 20% of their progress. You might have another check-in at maybe 50% of their progress. And then depending, maybe if it's something they have never done before, you might want to check in at 80 or 90%. So you can say if something is a little bit off track, they still have time to adjust it, rather than it's due to the client that day, and you look at it and there wasn't enough lead time. And that'll vary. If someone's doing a routine thing that they've done for you 20 times before, 100 times before, you probably don't need to do all the check-ins. You may not need to do any check-ins, but I wouldn't start that way. And the key thing is, by pre-scheduling those conversations, it's not micromanaging. You're acknowledging they're doing something new. You want to make sure they have all of the resources they need to get things done well. Of course, eventually you will want to dial back on those check-ins over time. However, if you find that you don't feel like you comfortably can dial back on check-ins, that may be a sign that someone is not the right match. And ultimately, this approach, and this is for everyone listening, by making sure people have the values, goals, and resources they need, and by pre-scheduling check-ins, say at 10 to 20%, around 50%, maybe around 80 or 90%, it helps you get better results, and it helps your team succeed. People want to do a good job, but don't just throw them in the deep end. And for instance, put them on a call with your biggest client on their first day at work with 5 minutes of background info, kind of thing. So Alex, thoughts on all of that?
That already alleviates so much anxiety. I'm not gonna lie. So I really appreciate you sharing that with me, because I've been banging my head against a wall of how to figure out not be too much in this person's business, because I don't like that. Like it hinders me from doing my job.
Yeah.
But then also like expecting, hey, whenever we say this is due this date, that means it is due this date, and like what it's going to take to get that product done. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
And, thinking, Jose Antonio, thank you for sharing in chat. You mentioned, remote associates often are working on different hours. For instance, give them a time range for when they can reach you on details. To expand on that, you also could consider having some sort of internal office hours. Here we're doing external office hours, but the more people you have reporting to you, you might want to say there's, an hour a day that you've dedicated for random questions, right? Whether it's you're on a video call and people can drop in, or you're on Slack or some other tool where they can reach out. The key thing is that you want to create time to answer inevitable questions. The problem when inevitable questions become an issue is when you haven't reserved time to answer them. You may not know the exact questions you're going to get, but something that's going to come up. And initially, rather than an hour every day, maybe it's an hour a couple days a week or a few days a week. Maybe it's Monday afternoon and Thursday morning or something. You can decide what works. And that also includes defining, especially with remote team members, what are the core hours they need to match. For instance, is it, in your time zone, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. or 10 to 3 or something where they need to overlap that somewhat. That'll be important to keep in mind. And Sean, thank you for the tip. Let's see, Ross, you mentioned pre-scheduled check-ins. Thank you. Sean, you mentioned MAP, an acronym for Mastery, Autonomy, and Purpose. Enable employees to master new skills, empower employees to align individual purpose with company purpose, and allow employees to work as autonomously as necessary. So Sean, thank you. Any thoughts, Alex, around final actionables as you take what you've learned here and apply it in your work?
Well, first things first is making sure our creative briefs aren't just detail-oriented, hey, hit word count, hit tone, but also include that kind of values piece so that we know why we're doing it, and being clear on my expectations as to like, hey, for this first draft, the client needs to get their eyes on it ASAP. So this needs to be as refined and typo-free as possible, and just being very specific about those things.
Yes.
And then I think also the pre-scheduled check-ins will be a completely necessary tool. We've put this employee has been around for a few months now. So now they're being incorporated into some larger client projects. And this will be completely necessary to make sure that those get all wrapped up and to our best standards, getting to the client's door. So thank you so much. I really appreciate this call.
Absolutely. Well, Alex, thank you for sharing. Good luck as you work through things, and please let me know how it all goes.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Absolutely. And Manish will be joining next in just a moment. And this is a reminder for everyone, right? If you're in an agency leadership role, whether as an owner or executive or manager, you are managing people. And, it is really easy to be a bad manager. And it's really hard to be a good manager, but I think it's worth it, right? Investing time and improving how you manage people, getting to know yourself better, it really pays off. Ultimately creating better things for you and your team, and also their families as well. In my grandfather's research, he was an organizational behavior professor for decades. One of the things he found was that when he surveyed employees of large companies, the employees' family members tended to have a much more negative impression of the company than the employees did. Yeah, maybe cut back on the employee complaints at home about work. The better you are as a manager, the easier it all will be. All right, and thank you again for everyone who shared on chat. All right, well, up next, Manish is joining us. Thank you so much for sponsoring today's episode.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you for having me. And really liking what we've been discussing so far.
Awesome. Well, and we met back in 2019 at the U Summit conference. where I was
Yes.
speaking about difficult clients. You're sponsoring the event. Since then, I know at least one of my clients has worked with you. I can't say which one out loud, but I will say their comment was that your team was doing a better job at the particular work than the agency's US-based team at a significant price difference. So, good stuff. And in terms of services, as the sponsor, E2M is a full service white label digital agency with a team of 150 plus experts. We've helped hundreds of agencies in the past 10 years to grow and scale, including white label services around website design and development, WordPress development, Shopify, and big commerce-based e-commerce solutions, SEO, and copywriting. Well, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you.
So
yeah, I know we are. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I understand you have some tips for people who either work with white label agencies or are considering it. What should people know to get better results? Sure
thing. So first of all, yeah, nice to meet all of you. It's great to see you guys. I've been I founded E2M 10 years back in 2012, and we've been running this agency since last 10 years. And from day one, we have been only working with agencies. So we are just like 100% white label digital agency. And we are an agency who works for agency. And over the 10 years, I have had a chance to work with literally like hundreds of agency owners. And as we speak, we already work with 115 plus agencies. So I guess, when I was talking to Karl, that's what we were talking. Like, I think since I have an exposure of working with so many agencies, then I'm like, okay, I'm going to share some of the things which will help you in case if you are already working with a white label part, or you are considering to hire a remote team as a white label partner, because since COVID, the remote work has exploded, and a lot of agencies are kind of like considering FTE, but remotely through a white label partner and like that, right? So kind of like that, there are so many things, I can share literally so many things, how to use your white label team effectively, or how to work effectively with your white label partner to get the most out of that. But I'll be sharing like kind of top 4 most. So one of the things, generally when you work with a white label partner, obviously you want to make sure that, the identity remains intact. So you do not want your white label team's identity to be revealed or their footprints to be shown any of your clients' work, right? So one of the tips I would share, like, if you haven't done it yet, then you should set up an email address for your white label team on your email address. So then what happens that, it becomes completely white label. So something like if you are, let's say, using white label development team, then dev team at your domain name.com. And I assume if they aren't part of your project collaboration tool, then you should have them as a part of your collaboration tool. So you have everyone as a part of your one collaboration tool, and it will make your life easy, where you are communicating with your team on the same tool, and you are communicating with your white label team on the same tool. And now what's happened, imagine you got a client's feedback, then you can just tag your white label team, hey, let's make this change, right? So it makes so much easy, where although they are your white label team, remote team, they act like as a part of your team. So this is something like, helps you a lot to make sure that, everything is white label, and your end client is not knowing that, okay, there is someone else is working on their project. Because a lot of times, you get a project and you get it done from your white label partner, and having like, making sure that they are a part of your PM tool will help you to set tasks, due dates for your white label team. So you can, commit to your clients ensuring about the on-time delivery of your clients' tasks and projects, right? So
That makes sense.
First,
And we're actually going to talk in just a moment in the next
yeah,
segment about PM tools. So that makes sense. Speaking of tools, I know you had mentioned your second tip was around Loom. Could you tell us more
yep,
about that?
yeah, absolutely. So one of the most important, things I have always observed, and one of the most common mistakes agency owners do is like sharing the feedback on text by be it like project collaboration tool or email, right?
Yeah.
Where it takes a lot of back and forth. Specifically, the feedback is very crucial and critical. So I highly recommend that if you have a feedback where you could envision, okay, this is going to create a lot of back and forth, then I would recommend using the Loom video. It's going to cost you like just $10 a month, but believe me, it's going to save a lot of time. And in the free version, you can anyway share up to 5 minutes of video as well. So sharing screen, speaking on video will save a lot of time, because now your team will be able to understand what exactly the changes you would like them to make. And be it anything, it could be design development or any feedback you would like to share, right? So
I love
using
that.
Loom video, yeah, using Loom video will be a lifesaver.
And that works, for everyone listening, regardless of the person you're communicating with in terms of where they're located. It certainly helps when you're communicating asynchronously. There may be time zone differences, but
Yeah,
I used Loom just last week to record something to share with Kate, where it was a lot easier to record. It ended up being like a 60-second video, just to say visually, here's what it looks like. Here's, and to sort of talk through things. So much easier. So what is your third tip?
yeah. I think think like that. Usually, as an agency owner, you always feel like, okay, this is my remote team. I don't know if they will understand what I'm trying to say or my feedback and like that. So then you will obviously would like to get on the call and explain them quickly, right? But that could be just a Loom video. But however, my third tip is that if you think that Loom video wouldn't be enough because you need input of your team, right? Then you
Mm,
should always schedule a Zoom call, right?
yeah.
So it is very important that when you work with your white label team, you schedule feedback calls over the Zoom or Google Meet on a regular time interval, maybe like bi-weekly or weekly or once a month, right?
Yeah.
Depending on the capacity you are working. If you are working like too much, right, then obviously it should be at least once a week, because
Yeah.
that's where obviously the project and task related updates you will be getting on project collaboration tool. But
Yeah.
let's say if you want them to share a feedback about improving the processes, or let's say you have a new work in the pipeline, or any major uh, challenge you are facing working with your white label team, or if in case if they are facing, they have any feedback to share with you, then these kind of like uh, Zoom calls help you a lot. And
Mm,
also, as a part of third team, I would recommend that sometimes you work with a white label team and they might be in a different time zone. Then at least you need to make sure they are available on Slack or Skype or
yeah.
any kind of Google Chat, instant messenger for at least an hour or two, couple of hours during your time zone to catch up real time. Because a lot of time happens, you would like to share like passcode, or you have a quick question
Right.
which makes so much easy, right? So my third tip is kind of like making sure to schedule a Zoom calls and having access to your white label team for at least few hours in your time zone, which is gonna make your life easy.
For sure. And that ties to, what I discussed with Alex earlier about making clear values, goals, and resources, and also building in whether it's internal office hours or pre-scheduled check-ins and all
Yeah,
that. It makes sense. And for your fourth tip, I understand you had some advice around quality, around how to ensure
yeah,
you're getting the right work.
yeah, sure thing. So I think since some of you might be just beginner at agency level, some of you are establishing SOPs and checklist and like that. So I think the quality is absolutely crucial. uh, I mean, needless to say. So in that case, either you should have like SOPs and standards and checklists and documents like that, right? Like what are the quality checkpoints every site should go through?
Yes.
uh, what are the like standards to develop the website? So it should be either you should have, or you should work with a white level, or you should recommend your white level partner that, okay, I want you guys to develop this kind of SOPs and checklist and then imagine, now you have a standard SOPs, checklist, and like that. That you could use as a sales material. So when the next time when you are going to get on a sales call, that becomes a competitive advantage. That okay, you are showing that you are just not another agency, but you have a SOPs and standards and checklist. So that builds a great level of confidence with your client. So I'll give you an example, right? So I was on a call 2 weeks back with an agency from Ireland, and then they do a lot of government contracts.
Okay.
And the first thing they said, we have to follow a great level of standards and checklists and like that, because we build websites for government. And do you guys have something like that? And the moment I saw them, and that was a big relief to him, because now overnight, they were able to use our checklist and SOPs and sell that. So I would highly recommend that, that solves two purposes, becomes a competitive advantage during your sales call.
Yes.
And also, a quality will not be an issue when you deliver something to your clients.
Thank you. Well, and I know, we could get into even more tips, but I want to make sure you have a special offer for listeners today. I understand the offer is this, thanks to E2M Solutions as today's sponsor for Agency Office Hours. People can get 20% off the first month if you use the link that we're sharing in chat, or if you're watching the recording, we have the link in the comments. Anything you'd add on that before we wrap up?
No, I guess, happy to, even if you guys are not looking for sign up for our services, if you have any questions around white label, how to use your white label team effectively, or if you have never used your white label team before, right? I would say, definitely you can reach out to me. And in fact, we have a guide I would love to share with you, where we have shared tons of recommendations, like how to use your team effectively. So I think I'll share with you here.
Awesome.
This is the one guide, you guys can go through and then learn more about how to use your white label team effectively.
Awesome. Well, Manish, thank you so much for joining today.
Absolutely.
And appreciate the tips.
Thank you for having me, Karl.
Absolutely. Well, up next, we have a question, speaking about project management software. We have a question from Jenny and Kelly. Let me go ahead and add you in on screen here. All righty. Well, Jenny and Kelly, thank you for joining today.
Thank you for having us.
So to paraphrase, and then you work together in your agency, paraphrase, your question is, what are the best project management tools for agencies? That is, what are some things you can use to make things go more smoothly? If you could elaborate a bit on your question, and then we can talk through answers.
Yeah, Kelly, would you like me to elaborate?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, we currently use, we are a website development, we're a digital marketing agency, and I lead our website development team, and Kelly works as the director of operations, but she also leads our inbound team. So we use Teamwork for our project management, but our projects are really the client strategy. It's not, we don't work in these long, projects that have a start and an end. It's the client strategy, right? So in Teamwork, we list out our projects, which is the client.
Okay.
And we use Teamwork for task management and time logging, and it's fantastic. But Teamwork doesn't provide us with resource scheduling capabilities. And that's really what we need. So we use Google Sheets to schedule out our resources. And that's been fine with the size that we are now, but we're growing. And we would love a tool that does both.
Got it. And what is your current headcount?
We currently have, about 40, Kelly?
32 or so around there, but we're kind of ambitiously growing. So we need to prepare for scaling up as well.
We're really our resources that we're speaking about are fulfillment resources that we're tasking daily tasks to, as short as 15 minutes and as long as 5 hours.
Got it.
Right.
And you're at the point where the spreadsheet approach has worked up until now on resource management, but I'm not surprised to hear that it's getting a little creaky. So that's totally normal. So looking at the question in terms of software options, teamwork is a popular option among clients I work with. This is hundreds of agencies all over the world. If we think about what are some of the most common, teamwork is one, Asana is another, Jira is another one as well. Monday seems to be getting some traction, possibly because they are advertising on YouTube everywhere. ClickUp is definitely one of those newly popular options. I use that with my own agency, the agency that does work for Sakas and Company. Very powerful. It does help to have someone who knows what they're doing set it up. So whether that's someone from your team doing work to figure out the configuration or hiring an integrator. I know that ZenPilot, for instance, specializes in ClickUp integration. So maybe worth checking them out so that you can get it set up right? Because there's always going to be switching costs when you migrate to new software. It might be perfect, it won't be perfect, but it might be in theory perfect, but you're still going through the pain of migration. In terms of resource management, and two others that sometimes come up, Notion, which is, it's more intranet-y. People do use Notion for project management, but it's a little open-ended. Basecamp has been popular for client communication, but it's not really project management software. And some of the company statements raise some questions about things. So when it comes to resource management, historically programmed Team Gantt, where you're basically having Gantt charts for the different team members, can be helpful. I would say people who are joining us live, I'm seeing some suggestions coming in. ClickUp, another for ClickUp, testing Asana and Monday, leaning toward Monday. If anyone has a favorite suggestion around the resource management piece, please share that in chat. The other thing to consider is that, at the 40, 42 mark, and then as you keep growing, you eventually may need someone who is dedicated, maybe not full-time yet, but part-time around traffic, around resource management specifically. Because the challenge is there's no perfect software solution, but when you have someone who generally knows what they're doing, they can use software and then use their experience, I guess, instead of artificial intelligence, natural intelligence, to make some judgments about that. So, I know I've mentioned a few different programs. I know you're using Teamwork. Have you explored any of those so far?
Kelly, I'll let you go on that.
Yeah, we actually had an initiative about a year ago to explore a lot of the ones, went through a whole list of ClickUp and several others. We explored Hive as one option that's pretty similar to ClickUp.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that one just came up a little bit short with some functionality we wanted, but I think it was close to the mark. The main thing that we're hitting up against, and we do have people that do the kind of, hands-on resource management you're talking about. Jenny and I do a lot of that ourselves.
Yeah.
But we're kind of missing that, like Jenny said, we don't really do a lot of big projects. It's a lot of task management. It's a lot of individual tasks within a client's retainer. And so we have these, our fulfillment resources are really jumping around a lot among all these different tasks. And so what a lot of these systems is missing is a nice dashboard display of what's going on for everybody on any given day, not just how many hours are booked, but what tasks for each client, and kind of that nice dashboard view so that we can easily see what's scheduled and what we might need to move around, things like that. That's where we've kind of struggled to, because otherwise Teamwork is great for most things. We end up using the Google Sheets, so we have that dashboard view.
And having been a director of operations and project manager, director of client services, operations manager, I think often it falls on operations to deal with everything else that needs to get done, right? Things just tend to sort of trickle down. It's like, oh, well, they're capable, they'll get it done, they'll figure it out. And that often happens. And Lyrian and Chad, thank you for the suggestion about Accello, ACCELO. At least one of my clients has used that, and they really liked the retainer management features in Accello. They weren't using all of the features, so it became a bit of a challenge around, do we need this for everything when we're just using part of it, but that part of it is really good. So I do think you may need to decide that you will need to use more than one tool. Ideally, hopefully automating things somewhat more than the spreadsheet approach, but there may not be a full all-in-one. When it comes to all-in-one, Workamajig is usually the software that comes up as the best all-in-one solution, but the challenge is you need to use it consistently and everywhere, because if not everyone is using it and they're not using it consistently, you have bad data, and that's the challenge. The other thing to think about would be the level of fidelity. Are you looking for a high fidelity solution where it's perfect and accurate, but probably expensive and time consuming? Is it medium fidelity, kind of a mix? And then low is like, it's not perfect, but you can figure it out. For instance, I'll check in with Diane, my COO, about how things look scheduling wise. So before I have a sales call, I have a general idea of how far out we're scheduling things. Now, she's using some software, but she's also using her experience, right? She's worked in agencies for decades. And so in that case, it's easier for me to ask, how are we looking in terms of scheduling out? And she can just make a judgment, as a range. Whereas if I wanted an exact time period or what have you, it would be a lot more complicated. So do decide, do you want high fidelity, which will be complex? Like an agency I worked at had a high fidelity process prior to my joining. They had 3 project managers. One of them spent half of their time every week managing the resource pool. Do you want to spend half of a project manager's time on the resource pool? Medium or low? So from what we've discussed, and I appreciate all the suggestions people have been sharing, looking at automating things when possible. Jenny and Kelly, what are your next steps from here? Beyond seeing what people shared in chat.
Yeah, of course. I think Kelly and I are in agreement that teamwork is fantastic for the task management. It works well. It's going to work well at our growth. But the resource scheduling piece, if we do need to have 2 tools, and we've talked about this as well, then we need just a replacement for Google Sheets. We need a resource management tool that it doesn't make our those that are tasking work out. They want to save time, obviously, and having to task it in 2 places is becoming a burden. So as far as next steps, I mean, we'd love to look at some of these options, but we're not really looking to just replace teamwork. We would keep teamwork if we can't have an all-in-one, right?
So with that in mind, it sounds like then, as you're searching, and I have an article that Kate has shared in chat of this point, 80 plus different PM software options for agencies. I think this is one of those, people have a PM challenge. If they have developers on staff, they build their own PM solution. I worked at an agency that had done that back in like 2003. By 2010, it was a little creaky, which, created some challenges. But it's like people build something that matches their needs. The challenge is, unless you build it yourself, which I don't recommend, it's never going to be quite a perfect match. So it sounds like as you're reviewing the list, probably want to focus specifically on resource management rather than say task management or broader project management. I mean, that might show up as a keyword, but it sounds like resource management is really going to be the key for you.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining today. Good luck, and let us know how things go.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Thanks. Coming up next, we have a question, and this will be our final question for today, a question from Ross. Ross, if you want to come on camera, come on mic. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So you have a question related to client meetings, and this is something that comes up frequently in my consulting work. To paraphrase your question, how many people from the agency should be in each client meeting? If you could, please elaborate on that question.
Yeah, so I think we're encountering kind of two challenges relating to this. I would say kind of by default, we're including anybody who might be working on the client project into calls, which ends up being quite a number of people. So for example, we might be having a biweekly retainer call with a client, and there could be 5 of us in the call. They're paying for 50 hours worth of work per month, and this ends up being a significant portion of the retainer hours, which they don't like.
Yes.
And then internally, we're hearing a lot of issues related to nobody can get anything done because they're in so many calls. Like, yesterday, 2 of our team members were in 4 hours of calls, and there's just not that much time left over, especially on a Monday, to actually get anything done.
Yeah.
But if they're not in calls, then there's kind of some issues about, does everybody know what's going on, and they're missing important context. So we're just kind of having trouble striking that balance.
The solution, if we think about how many people from the agency should be in each client meeting, is a bit of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? The porridge, not too hot, not too cold, just right. Of course, we shouldn't glamorize breaking into the bear's house and stealing their porridge, but that aside, the same thing here. You don't want to have too many people in the meeting because, one, you're wasting the client's budget, and it's also bad for the relationship if you've got 5 people in the meeting and 4 don't talk and just 1 does. Client's going to be wondering what's going on. On the other hand, you don't want to over economize, and maybe you should have, say, 2 people, but you have only 1, and then they end up spending almost as much time briefing the other team member on what's going on that you might as well just have had them in the meeting in the first place. So it's finding a balancing act. One way to look at it would be to think about my 6 agency roles. Every agency role fits into one of 6 categories: account management, project management, your subject matter experts like designer, developer, writer, that kind of thing, strategist, biz dev, and support. At minimum, the person who's wearing the account manager hat needs to be in every meeting. Now, they may also be doing double duty or maybe triple duty. Maybe they're also the project manager. They're coordinating things internally. When I was director of client services at an agency, I was doing a bit of both. It's also doing strategist work. As a project manager at another agency, officially my title was PM, but I was also doing account management. I was the primary client contact. So for sure, the person who is the client account manager needs to be there. If you have someone who's wearing a strategist hat and they are not already the account manager, at some agencies, you'll combine the roles. There's a question on when the strategist should be there. The strategist often should be there unless it's more of a status update meeting to the client on here's where things are, here's how things are going. However, for other meetings, the strategist should be there if it's, say, doing initial discovery conversations, if it's doing work to brainstorm solutions with the client, to understand what's going on. Maybe you've run into a challenge with the strategy and the client has some concerns. Probably makes sense to have the strategist involved, although maybe the AM should get some info first. Generally think twice about including lots of subject matter experts. Those would be your designers, developers, writers, analysts, and so on. In most client meetings, you probably want a lot of team members in the kickoff conversation, right? So that they can hear from the client what's going on. You do probably, if you want to make the most of the experience, have some sort of a pre-meeting internally about what's going on, where you review, here is the project or the retainer brief, here's what the client is trying to get done. As we talked earlier, for instance, with Alex about assigning things out, people want to understand the why. What are they trying to accomplish here, that kind of thing. I also, in the internal kickoff, I'll give the team, thinking as a PM in the past, context on where the client has been before. For instance, a client had hired someone in the previous agency, didn't handle things well. In retrospect, it was partly the client's fault, but okay, letting them know about that. Or in another case, the client had started things internally with the previous agency like 4 months earlier. So that way, when I was reminding the team, yeah, we're just getting started, but the client's already been doing this since last year, it helped add some context. So if the client was a little angsty about timeline, it was about the overall context. So with that in mind, you also want to budget for it to make sure that you're budgeting for people to join. my general guideline is to assume that of the projects or the retainer's total budget, you'll probably spend 20 to 25% on account management and project management. That includes people being at the meetings. So with all of that in mind, what comes to mind, Ross?
Yes, I think definitely one thing right off the bat, we do end up with a lot of SMEs in meetings. It seems like we could probably easily reduce the amount there. Sometimes the SMEs end up being the strategist too, but we certainly don't need, like, if somebody's an SEM SME, we don't need two people who are doing SEM, maybe just the lead, and the other person doesn't have to be there.
Exactly.
Now for the situations where we're not bringing in any SMEs, a lot of times we do bring them in because a lot of more, I guess, in the weeds questions come up, and it's nice to have them there to answer it.
Yes.
Is it just a better idea to have those recorded and then we report back after talking about it internally?
There is value to recording the meetings. That's helpful if, for instance, a client has someone on their side who can't join, or if you have other team members, or if there's a question later about what did we discuss. There's also a little bit of, just in case, having the recording can be helpful. Of course, this does tend to make your whether Zoom or other account take up a lot of space. You do need to get into like file management issues and things like that. I would say part of it is the project manager, whether they have a PM title or they're serving as a project manager, needs to be thinking about, like chess, several steps ahead. What is likely to come up in this meeting? What do we need to know from this meeting heading into the next meeting based on the client's level of sophistication? What is likely to come up? So there may be some cases where if they know there's a question that's likely to come up, they get answers in advance, whether in a pre-meeting or one-on-one with a subject matter expert, an SME, to be able to pre-answer those. The client's like, oh, what about blah, blah, blah? And you're like, you know what, I asked so-and-so about it. Here's the answer. That may solve it. And if it doesn't, you may need to do a follow-up. Speaking of pre-meetings and follow-ups, pre-meetings, the meeting before the meeting, gets a bad rap. But here's the thing. If you've got several people on your team and you need to make sure everyone's coordinated and, presenting a cohesive sense of what's going on, you need to do the pre-meeting. It doesn't just magically happen. And as Jose Antonio mentioned in chat, for instance, consider having two people from the agency. It's hard to lead the meeting and take notes at the same time. I'll do that with some of my meetings, especially sales conversations, where ultimately we can debrief afterwards and things like that, rather than running and tracking the notes from the meeting. So from what we've discussed, Ross, what's on your actionable list from here?
Yeah, I think I'm going to kind of establish some guidelines about who should be in what meetings, in what situations. And then, I really like the idea about trying to predict what sort of conversations are going to come out of this.
Yes.
And try and pre-answer those questions. And I think we're also going to try limiting the amount of meetings that SMEs come to, knowing that if these more technical questions come up, we can always answer them internally and send it through Asana or Monday or Basecamp.
Awesome. Well, Ross, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for your advice.
And thank you to everyone. That wraps up agency office hours from Sakas and Company for March 2022. I'm Karl Sakas. If you're watching this live, you'll get the recording afterwards. And if you're watching the recording, well, you have the recording now. I look forward to your joining a future agency office hours. We meet live here every second Tuesday of every month. If you have questions you'd like to ask, include the question when you RSVP. Or if you'd like to join in introvert-friendly mode, you can keep your camera off the whole time and just listen to what people share. Running an agency is never going to be easy, but it doesn't have to be so hard. And I'm glad that you're joining us today, whether to ask a question or to hear the answers and join in the discussion to make things easier. So thank you so much and good luck out there.